Welcome to the first lecture in Module 3, and in this lecture we'll cover relational databases. Now, just to orient ourselves, let's take a look at the web application architecture and tiers that we've previously defined, and I'll put a circle around the area that we'll be focusing on today. Now, typically this involves a relational database as a part of this back end that I'm showing here. More recently, there's something called NoSQL databases that have been created. Now, these databases that are relational databases are typically SQL databases, stands for SQL, Structured Query Language. As I've mentioned recently, there's these NoSQL databases that have become very popular, and those can also be made to work on a Rails backend. We won't cover that in this course, but I just want you to be aware of that. Relational databases are the most common way of persisting data within a web application. And a relational database is simply a collection of relationships between the records that are stored in tables in the database. Each row in a table corresponds to a record, and the columns correspond to fields, or sometimes these are referred to as attributes of the record. Here's an example. In this example, we have people, and I'm trying to collect information about people and store them in this database table. There's an ID, and notice that we have 4 records in this table. There's the first person, Frankfurter. We've got his first name, last name, address, and phone. Those are the attributes. And then the second person in the table, John Doe, we have listed with those 4 attributes as well. We have Jane Doe and again John Doe. John Doe is in this table twice because if you look at the phone column, it's different. He has 2 phones, therefore he's in the table twice. So what's the point of this ID field, the first attribute in that table? Well, this is what we're going to use to form the relationships that lead to the name relational database. That key or ID is referred to as the primary key in this table. It's the key you need to use to refer to that particular row of the table. So in this case, John Doe appeared in the previous table twice, as I've already mentioned. Why? Because he has 2 phones. Well, we need to think about whether or not that makes sense. One person can have many phones, so there's a one-to-many relationship here, and there's a way of pulling that out of the database, and that's referred to as normalization. So we can normalize the database by creating 2 tables, one for people and a separate table for forms. Now, database normalization is really the process of removing redundancy or dependencies in the database. And usually this involves dividing a large table into smaller tables and then forming relationships between those tables. So in our case, each record in the phone table is going to hold the ID of a person. I'll tell you what we're going to do here. And that's going to be referred to as a foreign key. I'll show you that on the next slide. And given the ID of a person, we can now search this phone table and find all of the phones that belong to that particular person. The way we typically search a database is using something called structured query language, as I've already mentioned. So this is SQL for short. And in Rails, we can avoid that because we have this active record design pattern that hides some of the SQL queries from you. And we'll cover active records in a lecture a little bit later in this module. So let's take a look at how we can normalize the database. Here I've pulled up the people table again, and notice that last column we've got the redundant information. We've got John Doe with 2 different phones. Well, let's split that off and stick it in a different table. So now if you notice, the people table only has 3 records, 3 entries, because the redundant information has been moved out and placed into the phone table. And the second attribute in the phone table, notice, is person ID. That's the foreign key in this table, and this foreign key points to the primary key in the people table. So here we have the first person is Frankfurter, and he's linked to that particular phone in the phone table. John Doe, there's one of his phones, and here's his other phone. They both point to the same record in the people table. So in this case, the foreign key is the same in the phone table. It's 2 for the person ID. Now, the structure or organization of a database is often referred to as a schema. And we use entity relationship models to model the relationship between the tables in a database. Here's an example of an entity relationship diagram for the 2 tables that I just showed you. We have the phone table on the one side, and then we have the people table on the other. And that crow's foot notation that you see on the right-hand side that looks like the crow's foot, that means there are many phones that can be associated with one person on the other side of that relationship. Again, a many-to-one relationship. Sometimes it's useful to think of the fact that a phone belongs to a person and that a person has many phones. When you're trying to design the appropriate structure for the data in your web application, you'll often find it useful to work at the schema level. And here's a tool that I like to use. It's called MySQL Workbench. And just do a Google search on this and download it, and it's free and you can install it on any platform. Now let me show you how you can create an entity relationship diagram using MySQL Workbench. And here it says EER diagram. This stands for Enhanced Entity Relationship Diagram. And here's the diagram that I've already created. And notice that for the primary key, it shows a key to indicate this is a yellow key to indicate this is a primary key. And for the comments, here's the primary key. And in order to create a link between the two, you use this tool here. And if I hover over this link, you'll see that it's relating the primary key to this foreign key. So the post ID is the foreign key in this comment table. And this tool is very simple to use. If I simply click on this, I can create a new table. And if I double click on it, I can add columns down here. And so, new column, and so forth. I can indicate that it's a primary key, and it creates that for me. If I want to create another table here and put a link between them, it's an association, you just do it in this way. MySQL Workbench is a very useful tool for visually generating schema that you can share with other developers that you might be working with on a software team. Now let's think a bit more about this example that I just showed you. We could further normalize this database by splitting the address table out as well. In this case, however, it's not just a one-to-many relationship. There's a one-to-many relationship between people and addresses, but many people can live at a single address as well. So it's actually a many-to-many relationship. And so let's take a look at this. We need a relationship between people and addresses that's many-to-many in both directions. And the way that this is typically done is by creating something in the database called a join table. It joins people to addresses. So in the next example I'm going to show you, I'm going to create a new table called addresses people, and it's only going to store foreign keys. It's not going to hold any primary keys. So let's walk through this. This is what we ended up with before, but now we want to create a many-to-many relationship. I'm going to split off that address column at the end of the people table, and here I've done that. Again, we've reduced it to two addresses because Jane and John Doe lived at the same address. But we've got to create this join table now that joins the two. Notice it only stores foreign keys. The person ID in the first row points to Frankfurter, and the address ID points to his address. In the third row of this join table, we point to Jane Doe, and that foreign key points to her address. I've opened up MySQL Workbench again and laid out a schema for the tables that we've been discussing. And this is the join table, right? So in the schema, this is the join table, and notice that it's got two foreign keys, one that points to this primary key and the other that points to this primary key, and there's no primary key in this table. So here's the schema that I just created for you in MySQL Workbench. This completes the first lecture in Module 3.